Hello and welcome to Sansad TV. You're watching Viewpoint with me, Frank PEREIRA. Well, this year marks the 75th anniversary of India and China establishing diplomatic relations. While India was the first non-socialist nation to recognize China, the relationship has been marred by several ups and downs. The unsettled boundary dispute has been a source of constant friction. But despite that, the LAC has been largely peaceful. Ties over the last few years have been frigid, especially after Doklam and Galwan. However, more recently, the bilateral ties have been warming up, with President Xi Jinping even calling for the Dragon-Elephant Tango. In this edition of Viewpoint, we will analyze the bilateral relationship between India and China. Joining me on the program today are Namrata, Hasija, Research Fellow, Center for China Analysis and Strategy, and also Professor Srikanth, Kondapalli, Dean, School of International Studies, JNU. Thank you to my guests for joining me on this edition of Viewpoint. Professor, let me start the program with you first. Let's first try and understand and analyze, before we go back into the history of the ties of 75 years, we'll understand the present and where the relationship stands as of today.
I think it is kind of a stalemate, but in a positive sense. Because other than trade, not much is moving in the India-China relations. Of course, as you mentioned, Frank, on October 21st last year, there has been the border disengagement and patrolling announced. And on October 23rd last year, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping met at Kazan in Russia, and they decided to expedite the matter on the border. However, we have not seen any spectacular development in terms of the border situation. Dr. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister, mentioned that there are some issues left that need to be tackled in terms of the disengagement and patrolling. However, there is no de-escalation and de-induction of troops so far, and that is creating some concern on the Indian side. So on the 75th anniversary of the bilateral relations diplomatic establishment, we have not seen the Indian side celebrating. We did see the Chinese side announcing a slew of measures to celebrate the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations. So we are at a stalemate, but in a positive way, in the sense that there is some momentum forward. However, India is not yet satisfied.
Absolutely. All right. Namrata, Hasija, let me bring you to the picture now, and let's try and understand and try to gauge what's really happening with regards to India and China. At the moment, President Xi Jinping has called for the Dragon-Elephant Tango as well. And where do you see all of this in the current sphere of things?
Thank you for the questions. I think the first thing that I like to point out is that whatever that we are seeing in the relationship, to me, is tactical and temporary. It's not that India-China relationship, of course, the agreement that has happened, I'm not saying it's not a positive sign, but we also have to look at the larger picture. I think Professor Kondapalli has pointed out that other than trade, there's not much that is happening. And yes, disengagement, there were 2 patrols that happened in November at Depsang and Demchok. And also there are other points that are not, we are not talking about them. There are only 2 points where the patrolling happened. And also, like he pointed out, we are not talking about de-induction. Right, there are still 60 to 70,000 soldiers on both sides. And then let me just, we are talking, yes, Professor Kondapalli gave an Indian perspective. I'm also talking about what the Chinese are writing about it. So if you look at their writings also, they also don't seem very positive. Though the display, whatever they are displaying is like Professor Kondapalli said, they are celebrating the 75 years. I'll just give you one example of this Chinese scholar, Liu Zhongyi, who is the director in the Shanghai Institute of International Studies. And this institute is, of course, linked to the United Front Work Department. So it's kind of, what he's saying official. He's saying that we should not, really believe what India is saying when it comes to, this disengagement. And India has never, kept its words, and also criticized, our Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri. He said, I met him in 2022 when he was the Indian ambassador to China, and he kind of, said what Chinese have given to India. So there's, you would see in this article, there's a continued criticism of India, and he also points out that whatever is happening right now, we have to analyze it as Chinese and not fall for, what India is building on these false narratives, because we cannot trust India. Then also I will point out here, the last thing is, there was an article a couple of years ago written by Hu Shishang, who's also one of very known Chinese scholars, and he's associated to Kikir. Now, he wrote that since the inception of India and China, that is after we got our independence and they were liberated in 1949, we were bound to have a clash. And looking at the India-China relationship and analyzing it, he sees more clashes to happen in the future. So, yes, whatever is happening, positive sign, but we still have to keep in mind that looking at the Chinese literature, like just look at the articles that have come in the last 1 month. They have not been positive. They are saying that India has moved ahead only because it is facing these US tariffs. And that is the reason why. But I would put it the opposite way. I feel that it is because of the slowing Chinese economy and the tariffs that it is facing from the US that they have actually come to the table and have had this agreement. They need a market. The US market now, at least temporary, shut for them. So they need a bigger, and India is the biggest market. So that is the reason why they have, come forward to the table to have this agreement. This is my point of view, but they have been, writing that it is because India needs, this economic relationship. That is why they have come back to the table.
But it's the other way around, is what Namrata Hasija is pointing out. It's really the Chinese need the Indians at this point in time because of the markets closing for them elsewhere in the world. Professor, let me come back to you now. I want to take up this particular issue that, we touched upon about trust. Now, over the years, we've seen that there has been a trust deficit really between the two countries, and it's very difficult to take anything on face value because of what has been followed up after any kind of an agreement or any kind of a conversation. Do you see that changing? What's really, the bone of contention, or how do we look at this issue of trust deficit?
I think one of the key elements in the bilateral relations is the lack of trust between the two sides, and this is to a large extent driven by what is happening on the border. There is heavy mobilization, there is no de-escalation, so there is a heavy mobilization of both troops as well as military equipment. Previously, from 1988 to 2020, we had CBMs, confidence building measures. And one of the ways of projection of CBMs is trust building. Once you have the CBMs, then trust is supposed to build up. However, we have not seen that graduation happening, and hence the incidents on the border created more mistrust, because many of the CBMs suggested that for example, on the line of actual control, both the sides will not mobilize forces in the direction of the line of actual control. However, we have seen periodically the troops are mobilized towards the border, the LAC, and hence the trust levels are low. Secondly, there is a no-fly zone of nearly 60 kilometers on either side, but we keep on hearing about helicopter intrusions in these areas. So that also leads to the trust kind of breakdown. Thirdly, there is also a provision in the CBMs that there should not be any military exercises with the border as the orientation. But in 2019 October, when Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping were discussing at Mahabalipuram, we saw that 2 brigades of the Chinese from Aksu and Kashgar were moving towards the line of control in conducting military exercises. So this also depletes the trust level between the two sides. There are so many other areas where we see the trust not building up, despite the CBMs written by and signed by both the sides. So this is the key problem in the bilateral relations. In order for the trust to be built up, of course, the border areas need to be inspected by both the sides. They should come to an agreement to their satisfaction on the troop level, their level of preparation or mobilization. So these have not been implemented in the last 4.5, 5 years, and hence the trust levels are pretty low.
Absolutely. All right. Let me take the points that you're making forward with Namrata as well. Two aspects. We've been speaking about the border, and we all know that, that's the real problem between India and China, the issue that we have on the border. But by and large, compared to any other borders around the world as well, we've seen the border being peaceful. That is one. The second aspect, of course, being, the point that you made about trade. Could that also be an opportunity for India and China to work together going into the future?
Actually, when it comes to trade, we are actually doing a study at our Center for China Analysis and Strategy. We are identifying the areas. Now, the dependency that we have on China is actually too much. Can you imagine that 95% of the umbrellas that we have are actually from China? Something that we can make here, right? And not only the umbrellas, but also the spikes, the handle, everything. This is a very small example. And, so there are areas where our security is in question. Now, we have to identify those areas, and at least in those areas, probably not cooperate with the Chinese, because we have to find alternatives. We have seen in COVID, we have seen also, you have to understand that in key areas where we are dependent on them, like the pharmaceuticals or some other areas, in the time of, when there'll be tensions will be there, when it will be at the height of the tensions, they can actually just, pause those things. And we are so dependent on them that we have not even found an alternative for that. Of course, we are talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat, and we have to talk about it, and there we have to find alternatives to it. So trade is something that the Chinese are very keen on it. And that is, like I said, because of our biggest market, we have 400 million cash-rich middle class. So that is what they are looking for, and they are going to dump their goods here. Now, when we are talking about trade, we have to, also understand that India needs to build its own strengths when it comes to trade. COVID has been an excellent example for the world to realize that what happens when the supply chain breaks. And for me, the Chinese have always said that let's keep the border issue on the side. Let's focus on commercial ties. Let's focus on other ties. And that is, you see what they have been also saying now. More people-to-people ties. They have been asking for direct flights to be resumed. More cooperation between think tanks and academicians and journalists. We've already had a couple of Indian journalist delegations visiting, China. And they also are keen on having their own journalists here. And we are very well aware of what other things the journalists were doing here, especially Xinhua and People's Daily Journalist. So for me, what you're saying that can trade be a positive, can actually bring it to a positive direction, to me it's like the deficit is so large. And we have been talking about semiconductor industry, we have been talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat. So how are we going to do that if we keep on depending on trade? And for me, then, looking at the Chinese activities here in India and South Asia, it's like I said, I don't think, we can actually separate the two issues. And in trade also, you look at the FDIs that we are having, and many actually people raise the objections that in Delhi we have so many CCTV cameras. Most of them are, from China. So we have to identify the areas, is what I'm saying, and we also have to build our own capabilities. And to me, like I said, this India-China disengagement is very temporary and very tactic. So for me, we don't have to really, kind of let our guards down, because we have to, also keep in mind that why the Chinese are doing it and what they did in 2020, why they did it. because this is not one commander, some local commander that took this action, because you look at the areas where we had the skirmish. We all are talking about Galwan because that is where we lost our 20 soldiers and they also lost 4 soldiers. But we also have to understand that there are other areas that we haven't discussed this, that there was actually a coordination between at least 2 or 3 military regions of China, and that cannot be done without the approval of the CMC. And President Xi Jinping is the head of CMC. So we have to keep this in mind.
Absolutely. Be watchful, be alert, and history tells us that do not take anything on face value, always be on your guard is what the panelists are suggesting. All right, Professor, let me come back to you now. Of course, tariffs, President Trump and what he is doing seems to be the flavor of the season. Is that in any way going to have an impact on the bilateral relationship between India and China? And how do you see that playing out?
I think there will be some impact. To start with, I think since United States has given a reprieve of 90 days, so in July, the tariffs on India would be recommencing, depending on the negotiations between the two sides. At the moment, all of the tariffs are on China at around 124%, and the Chinese also retaliated for the United States. So this is leading to a kind of trade war between the two sides, and India would also be caught up not so in the future, not so far in the future. So that is one. Secondly, because the tariffs are intact on China and at around 124%, it is likely that China will use third markets, as it has been using in the China plus one strategy of using the MFN status through Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia, or Mexico or other countries. So these now are under question because Vietnam received some 46% tariffs and Vietnam is negotiating with the United States. So the dumping of goods through the third markets is likely to happen in the near future. Second, China is going to diversify the trade from the United States of nearly $548 billion. This has to be pushed on to other markets, and India is one candidate. Europe or other countries will be the targets for China. So we have to see that the level of illegal dumping by China needs to be watched carefully into the Indian market, because all the goods that are going to the United States from China will be diverted to third markets, including India. So we need to be monitoring closely the situation on the border, on the maritime areas. So this is a second measure that we need to follow. Third, China is also using the MFN status we extended to them in 1984, and also dumping goods through Laos and Cambodia or other markets. So we need to be vigilant on looking at the third markets in terms of these goods being diverted. Fourth area that we need to also look at, given the US-China tariffs, is that, as Namrata mentioned, there is the 400 million middle class who are going to spend a lot of money, and China is viewing this segment, and we have been able to block so far, but the flood is so ominous that we need to take extra measures to control these flood of goods from China. there is also likelihood of the Chinese coming to India with a proposal for third market re-exports from the manufacturing centers in India. So this is a likelihood. They did propose this in 2014. However, we did not implement this, but we will be under heavy pressure in this regard in the future as well. So these are some things that China would desperately resort to, because they said that they want to maintain 5% growth rate this year. And it is not possible without the $500 billion of trade being diverted from the United States to the other markets. They did divert to the ASEAN, which has now over $900 billion of trade with the Chinese, but this would also be diverted towards other markets, including India.
Right, absolutely. Okay, Namrata, Hasija, let's quickly look at what next. What is the future like really as far as India and China ties are concerned, because we've been hearing as well for a few years now that this is going to be the century of India and China. Where do you see this headed?
For me, I think when we are negotiating with the Chinese, or when we are looking at India-China relations, there are a couple of things that will actually come up and that we have to watch out for. First, of course, is the Dalai Lama issue. He's already, the Chinese have been putting a lot of pressure. They have been writing a lot of articles and kind of building their case that they really want to avoid like a situation where they'll have we'll have two Dalai Lamas. So that is something that will definitely come up, because if you have if you've seen the latest book by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, where he actually mentions very clearly that his reincarnation will be born in a free world. So definitely not China. And maybe what if he's born in Arunachal or Sikkim? So that will be something that will come in play when it comes to India-China relationship in the future, and for me a very important event that will happen, and that is when the Chinese will put immense pressure on us, and we really have to keep these things in mind. The second that we have to keep in mind is the military build-up in Tibet. And especially, the Western Theatre Command, the new equipment that is being inducted, 35 more airports, both either of dual use or military use, are being planned in TAR that will come up by 2035. We have to look at that. The constant building of the Xiaokangs, already 645 Xiaokang villages are there. They are still building on that, and the border management, where they're including the locals in that, and guarding the border. We have to look out for that. So there are many issues. We cannot treat India-China relationship in isolation and just look at what's happening now. So these issues we have to, because it's been a constant build-up that they are doing since, of course, even before, but after 2020, we have seen that. We've been following it very closely. So these things we have to keep in mind. They are not doing it to kind of, like I said, we are not talking about the induction. So here also in the Western Theatre Command, especially in Tibet Autonomous Region, whatever they are doing, we have to watch it very closely. And to me, these are the factors that will come in the future of India-China relations, which India needs to keep in mind when we are talking to them, negotiating with them, and also planning our future ties with China.
Absolutely. All right, we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you to both my panelists for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. Much appreciate your time here. All right, what's coming out of this discussion is that the warming of ties are certainly in a positive direction, but China being China, we need to always be on our guard and watch out for what may come next. Trump's tariffs are going to have an impact on the ties, and we have to be aware of China dumping its goods into India and other places as well, and thereby impacting the relationship. And of course, strategic areas is something that we need to guard carefully and keep our eyes open there as well. But for now, ties seem definitely headed in the positive direction. Let's hope that they stay that way. That's it on this edition of Viewpoint. See you again next time.
To watch more programs of Sansad TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to like and share them.